in the mid-13th century, there were 12 ships that arrived at a port in Sicily from the Far East. There were throngs of people waiting for them, and excitedly, of course, because of the loved ones who had arrived and of the cargo that they had brought. An excitement that soon turned to terror when they realized that majority of the sailors on board were dead. And whoever was alive was barely surviving. All of their bodies were covered with boils. Blood was oozing and pus was oozing from those boils. Now, the port authorities quickly surmised that there was a deadly infection that had plagued these 12 ships, and so they hurriedly pushed back these ships away from their shores. A move that was too late, though, because that marked the beginning of the spread of a pandemic all across Europe that was to become known as the Black Plague or the Black Death, a pandemic that ultimately took the lives of over 20 million people worldwide. Now, when Lali and I visited Sicily several years back, we could not have imagined that that same island was the site of a horrific, pandemic, because it was one of the most beautiful places we've seen. We were on a Mediterranean cruise, part of guests of Datu Sri Vijay and Datin Sri Umayal to celebrate their wedding anniversary. It was a trip of a lifetime, really very memorable. And we enjoyed Sicily. We enjoyed the culture. We enjoyed the food. We enjoyed everything. Okay, in that place. Who would have known that they had been hit by a pandemic, several hundred years back? But that's really what, life is all about, isn't it? Yes, there's death, but then ultimately there's always a rebirth. It's the circle of life. Well, today I would like us to focus in on that stage of rebirth, because just like, the world way back in the 13th century and again at the turn of the 20th century, we're in the midst of a great pandemic, and a pandemic that has really devastated the entire world, that has brought us into great despair, brought a lot of sorrow and loss and grief and fear, and just really turned our entire world upside down. But there are things that we could learn from history, and I'd like to focus in on 3 things that we could learn from the pandemic of the 14th century. Because interestingly, that Black Death was one of the last major events before the beginning of another era or another period, okay, which was it was the end of what was known as the Dark Ages, which spanned from 400 AD all the way up to the 14th century. And then from the 14th century to the 17th century began what is now known as the Renaissance period. Now, if you were to look at the definition of the word rebirth, it means something that flourishes after a decline, or a revival, or a renaissance. And so it's interesting that after that Black Death pandemic came the Renaissance period. Something hopeful to really think about where we're at today, isn't it, in 2021? And something I'd like us to focus on. In fact, there are 3 things I wanted us to focus on and learn from, hopefully. Number 1, the Renaissance period brought about a new way to correct. Do you know that the word quarantine came as a result of the Black Death? There was a port in Venetia that, tried to contain the spread of the pandemic by requiring ships that arrived, that docked, to remain, okay, distanced and not, disembark for 30 days. It was called Atrantino. And when they realized it was not enough, they shifted and made it a 40-day, a 40-day, social distancing. It was the beginning of social distancing. And that became the root word of quarantine. It did help because that was one of the cities that really didn't see as great of an, impact of the Black Death as the other ports. So there was a new way to correct that they learned. And that obviously, as more information, was gathered, there was also, they were able to stem the tide and turn back the tide or the spread of that pandemic. There was also a new way to communicate. See, in the early 14th century, 1405 in fact, the printing press was invented. And what that did was revolutionize the way people communicated. All of a sudden, information that was just limited to scholars, to a very small group of educators or academics and statesmen and politicians and, the royal family and so forth, all of a sudden this information spread. And the start of mass communication happened, where the masses became educated, where the masses became informed, where the connectivity between classes and lines, okay, were established by virtue of one invention, the printing press. And of course, with the advent of the printing press and mass communication, there was a new way to create. Kingdoms, empires were created. The Spanish Empire was created, right? The Portuguese, the Dutch empires, the British Empire. All of this really happened in the age of exploration that was the Renaissance period. Why? Because with the new ways to correct, the new ways to communicate, and the new ways to create, old medieval norms, beliefs, and mindsets were debunked, were challenged, and were ultimately changed. New, norms and beliefs like the world is flat. I mean, it's unimaginable nowadays, isn't it? That you would think, why would people believe that the world was flat, that the earth was flat? But that was the belief for years and years and years and years. And people operated based on that. That was the operating system. There were ships already, but that was the operating system, that the world was flat. And so they only contained them, they contained themselves and limited these expeditions to, regions, because they didn't want to fall off the cliff, so to speak. But with the advent of information that was gathered and the expansion of thinking that happened because of that, then they challenged the notion that the world was flat, and the age of exploration happened. Or that the sun revolved around the earth, isn't it? It is also during the Renaissance period that Copernicus basically debunked that notion and said, no, okay, the earth is the one that revolves around the sun. So the solar system was birthed. So there were, along with the deaths, the horrific deaths that happened because of the Black Plague, and also obviously the things that people had to do to adapt, okay, during that time, though all of those resulted in what was to be known as the Renaissance period, a period where the world thrived economically, politically, educationally, okay, and culturally. Now, how does that impact us today? So like I said, I'd like to draw some parallels to that period because I believe that we too today have the opportunity to create our own Renaissance period. But it's not something that will happen automatically. Neither will it just happen organically or, by default. For things to change, we have to change. And just like old norms, beliefs, systems, and ways had to change to usher in the Renaissance period, so too do we need to go through a rebirth to be able to create this Renaissance period. Now, the idea of rebirth, if we remove the spiritual side, okay, of it, I know that some of us do believe in reincarnation, okay. I belong to a belief that, as a Christian, that I have been born again in my spirit. But all of that aside, rebirth happens, as I said earlier. But the question is not whether we will be reborn. Okay, I don't want to go into an argument with that. But it really is the fact that there is rebirth that happens, and it keeps happening. The question really is, what kind of rebirth do we want to happen? Because that's where we do have control. That's where we do have a choice to make. Let's look at our bodies. Do you know that our bodies have about, 50 to 75 trillion cells of different kinds of cells, and each cell has a lifespan. So for example, our red blood cells, they have a lifespan of 4 months. Okay, so after 4 months, those cells die. Now, we're more than 4 months old, isn't it? And we still have, living red blood cells flowing all across our veins. So what happened there? There was a rebirth, and it's a continual rebirth of new cells. New cells keep being generated by our bodies. Our skin cells have a lifespan of only 2 to 3 weeks. So technically, every 2 to 3 weeks, ladies, we have a new skin. Now, how I wish that the new skin would look younger, less wrinkles, every 2 to 3 weeks, right? But that doesn't happen automatically. New doesn't necessarily and automatically mean better. Rebirth doesn't necessarily equate to better. We do have to do some things. So if, for example, I wanted better skin, I can't just slap, creams and lotions on my face. I've got to also recognize that I need to make some changes inside out in terms of my what I eat, right? More hydration, better sleep, less toxins and chemicals in my food, in the air, in the water, right? Thank God for our products like Home Pure and Air Pure. All of these things, they're small things that when you add up, they do help our cells, the new cells, be better than the previous, okay? So how do we take these 3 lessons from history and make sure that we can have a better rebirth this 2021? The new way to correct. Quarantine was created because of the Black Plague, right? So how do we correct? What is it that we need to correct? Well, one of the other things that I interestingly read recently was that if we were to look at the people who unfortunately and tragically lost their lives because of COVID-19, the statistics show that majority of them had what are called as comorbidities, or conditions, additional conditions, maybe 1 or 2 or 3, that impacted and basically had an effect on the degree of severity of the primary condition, which was exposure to the COVID-19 virus. So comorbidities play a major role. And what were the top comorbidities that they found? Well, the first was obesity, being more than overweight, okay, beyond overweight, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and so forth. Okay, so when a person has any one or more of these comorbidities, the risk to actually dying from COVID-19 becomes higher. Now, in the context of our business, of course, in terms of COVID-19, the obvious lesson there is if we want to not just avoid exposure to COVID-19, but if we want to survive and really even thrive in this, pandemic, then we need to also look at our comorbidities and see if there is the presence of comorbidities in our bodies. Are we overweight? Do we have, existing conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and so forth? Because if we do, then the obvious thing to do is to also resolve those issues so that we don't get adversely affected by COVID-19. Or if we don't have those comorbidities, right, then we want to make sure that we remain, that our bodies remain absent of those comorbidities. That takes correction. That takes massive correction. Correction in terms of our diet, what we eat. Correction in terms of how we move, exercise. That study showed that if only people did two things better, if they ate a little bit more healthier, and if they exercised a little bit more, the impact of these comorbidities to COVID-19, relative to COVID-19, would actually greatly reduce. What about our business? We do have comorbidities as well, isn't it? If we did not have any comorbidities, then your entire team would remain intact today, even after, even with the pandemic. But the reality is, we've lost a lot of people in our teams, isn't it? We've also probably, and maybe we're still standing after 2020, but, how sure are you that you don't have any of these underlying conditions that will greatly impact your ability to not just survive, but thrive in this time of pandemic, in the time of COVID, which is going to probably last for another 2, 3, 4 years. Depends on how fast people will get vaccinated all across the world, isn't it? So what are your comorbidities, or what are the risk factors that you have that you need to correct? Comorbidities in terms of, your mindset, your belief system, your norms. Comorbidities in terms of your habits. What are the things that are going to adversely impact you that you need to correct? Just like the pandemic, Black Death, and even this pandemic has resulted in major cultural corrections, major personal corrections, major economic corrections across the world, across the lines, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of culture, regardless of nationality, regardless of age. Corrections have been made today that were unthinkable in the past. What kind of corrections are you making in your business? What kind of corrections are you making in your presentation? What kind of corrections are you making in terms of your practices? There are comorbidities in our networking practices that need to be addressed, that need to be corrected, and that need to be corrected fast, because these comorbidities, these unethical practices, these unprofessional practices, these gray areas, okay, where we make claims, where we don't tell people the full truth, where we, hide, some information. These are comorbidities that if we don't correct these will detrimentally impact us and our business more than ever. These are comorbidities that need to be addressed sooner rather than later. It's time to correct, guys. And now is the time to do that. If we don't do those corrections today, in terms of our language, in terms of our perspective, in terms of our mindsets, our beliefs, and yes, our practices, then we're not going to survive. You don't want to be a statistic. You want to be a testimony. You want to be a success story, isn't it? You didn't sign up to QNet to fail. You didn't buy those products to fail. You didn't make those presentations to fail. And yet, if we don't make corrections, what are the odds? They just get higher. Secondly, new ways to communicate. Printing press was the revolutionary thing in the 14th century. Today, it's digitalization. It's amazing how my 90-year-old mother-in-law, has learned how to enjoy the use of these effects on Messenger, so that when we have our family messenger calls, she really enjoys, those different effects. But who would have thought? Prior to the pandemic, all she had was a dumb phone. My sister-in-law couldn't even get her to use an iPhone. It was too complicated for her. But imagine, because of the new ways to communicate, because of the fact that she was forced to learn, and she's now, enjoying messenger rooms and messenger effects. There are new ways to communicate, isn't it? Digitalization has opened up the world to us from a communication and a connectivity perspective. But what does that mean to us? Has it resulted in better connections with people for us? Or are we experiencing, digital fatigue already at this point, or digital media fatigue, Zoom fatigue, or whatever kind of fatigue there is? Well, the world is also changing from a digitalization perspective. McKinsey says that in 2020, the digital transformation that occurred in 2020, was 10 years worth of transformation. That simply means that what would have taken 10 years, to create this level of transformation, all happened in just, less than a year. It happened, change didn't just happen, but change happened so fast and so great. How are you when it comes to digitalization? Even direct selling has already been evolving and adapting to this change. More and more companies are calling our profession social selling. They're not even saying e-commerce. They're saying social selling, because they recognize that the social part of it is so crucial now more than ever. And when they say social, it's not just a social face-to-face, because that really has been greatly affected, but it's really now social in terms of digital media. Now, some of you are saying, oh, you know what? I wish I'd like to go back to the old days where I could have my system and, face-to-face and so forth. Yes, we all long for that because we're social beings and we really long for connection, and the old ways to connect is really something that we all miss. How I wish I could even, I could even hug the people that I love. The few times that I've seen my kids, it's like, should we hug or not? It's like something that you have to think about, and kind of like, it's really a very sad situation. However, from a business standpoint, how social are you today? Have you been allowing yourself to be reborn from the way you do business? Have you been looking at your system being reborn? And I know that We used to say, don't reinvent the wheel. Well, that also is out of the window. Okay? The world has really changed. Now is the time to reinvent the wheel. If there was a time in the history of, of mankind, now is the time to reinvent the wheel. Can you imagine if Copernicus didn't reinvent the wheel? Magellan wouldn't have discovered the Philippines, where my beloved nation, isn't it? So many new things wouldn't have been explored, new lands, and so forth. So it's time to reinvent the wheel, but reinvent it in such a way that you don't just make a better version of yesterday's system. Get your system reborn. Make sure that you change your system so that it can not just, survive the next 2-3 years, but that it's positioned to thrive for many, many, many years to come. Everything is changing around us. Don't hold your system so close to your heart and say, oh no, must not change this. Everything needs to be relooked at because everything will be rebirthed. We all need to undergo that rebirth as a person, as a leader, as a Donna, as an upline, our business, our system, everything. Even QNet needs to be rebirthed in terms of its products, okay, in terms of, how it pays people. Because the reality is, guys, okay, our unique selling proposition of, you can do this business at your own time, be your own boss, anytime, anywhere, okay, little startup, and so forth, no bricks and mortar, leverage and so forth. Guess what? I don't know if you know this, but even prior to the pandemic, for years now, that USB has already, is no longer unique to us. It still is our selling proposition, but it is no longer our unique selling proposition. It has also become the selling proposition of the gig economy, of companies like Uber, of Airbnb, of Grab, of Lazada, of Instagram. And unfortunately, they have been doing a much better job of using digitalization to be able to, do their business. They have been doing a much better job of not just pivoting, but adapting, adjusting, accommodating, and ultimately creating something new, totally new, that was unheard of before. So how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to continue to allow them to be better at what's really originally ours? Or can we also undergo a rebirth in that so that we can, instead of being so, oh, this is us and we're very protective, that we become more inclusive, more open to the new, more open to new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of, correcting, and new ways of creating. Point number 3, as I end. New lands were explored during the Renaissance period. And new masterpieces were created by artists like Da Vinci, Donatello, this philosophers and so forth. How did they do it? They had to expand their ways of thinking. They had to break down the barriers. They had to break down remove the labels and say, okay, I'm a painter. That's all I do. Leonardo da Vinci was a great painter, yes. He also was a great sculptor, inventor, architect. So was Galileo. They used science, they used math. They didn't just use their artistic abilities, creativity. They used all of this new information that was now all of a sudden accessible to them. And they used the information to enlarge their way of thinking, to, enlarge their capacity and abilities by adding new interests and new understanding, and not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but taking all of that and fusing them to ultimately create masterpieces that outlasted them, outlived them, that are more valuable today than ever before. What are the things that you're learning? What are the things that you're thinking of? What are the things that you're challenging yourself to look at differently today? What if you started doing that? We have been living our lives more and more because of the devices that we have, especially the past year. We could not have survived without our devices, isn't it? Whether that be our phones, our tablets, our desktops, or laptops. Well, what have you been using those devices for? Were they just means to communicate? Well, you know what? There's so much information going around right now. So many new podcasts, free education, free learning, free courses. They're all digital, things that you didn't have access to before. And all of a sudden, they're available virtually and they're mostly free. Are you taking advantage of that so that you too can become like a Renaissance man, the Renaissance man that Leonardo da Vinci was? That's our challenge. You want to be reborn. Why not desire and decide that you will not just be reborn by going with the tide, but that you will be reborn into a Renaissance man, a Renaissance woman who will create things out of this darkness that will be magnificent, that will be amazing, inspiring, compelling, and that will stand the test of time because you're building to last something that will outlast your lifetime. Now more than ever, the opportunity to be reborn is here, but more importantly, the opportunity to be reborn as new. Just like our cells, we create our bodies, they're actually practically new, right? Because of those cells, we too can become new. I'd like to end with this, something that struck me way, way back when I first heard about it. And this is that you can't put new wine into old wineskin. You can resist change. You can still wait for the time when things will go back to normal, right? They never really will, but it's your choice if you want to wait for that. You can choose to say, I want to live in the medieval ages, in the dark ages. I love that. That's my comfort zone. I hope not. I really hope that you decide today in this V Convention Connect that you will become that kind of a person who will be reborn into the person that God created you to be in the first place, so that you can do the things, the amazing things that God created you to do, gifted you to do, and prepared in advance for you to do. Why? Because this is not just about us. In the same way that the Renaissance period was really not the end goal, but what it really did was bridge the gap between the Dark Ages and modern day civilization as we know today. What we're going to be doing this 2021, the next 2-3 years, we're going to be bridging the gap. It's a huge gap, but we can and we must, because what we're building is not for ourselves, but it's for the generations to come. Just like what was built and created by those amazing people during the Renaissance period lasted till today and is impacting our lives till today, so too can we be rebirthed into Renaissance men and women who will correct, who will communicate, and who will create things that will outlast our lifetimes, that will be built to last because we decided to do things differently today. God bless you all.
Got me